In between Tank Girl and the Gorillaz, there was Get The Freebies. We'll see how much YouTube lets me show, because this comic is irreverent. I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and today we're going to be reviewing something that was sitting behind me for quite some time. It's finally gotten to move on down. It's something that's a bit off of the beaten path. It's definitely falling more into the subcultural realm and the 90s subcultural realm. We're gonna get deep into the indie comic scene. What I've got here is Phoo Action, the deluxe edition. This is for the Silver Jubilee. As you can tell, there's a mark on it. It did not come with the mark. It's because I've been reading it and I besmirched it with my fingers, my human fingers. Get Freebies was by Hewlett and Wakeham. As mentioned, it's been behind me for several videos. That was because I was combing my way through it. There's a lot in here. It took me a while and there's a bunch to unpack. Now, this is not sponsored, but Titan was kind enough to send this to me. And once I started going through it, I knew it was something that I wanted to talk about. It activated my love of comic history. It appeals to it because there's a lot of obscure knowledge in here. This is a collection of what some thought was the long lost Get The Freebies. So just what is Get The Freebies? Well, it's a bit hard to explain because the structure is a little loose, so we're gonna have to do a broader overview and then kind of get more into it. But to try and contain it, the protagonists are Terry Phoo, a gay Asian kung fu superhero type, sort of, but not really on the last part. The superhero elements are much more satirical. He does have a great yellow tracksuit though. There's also his partner, Whitey Action, a young, very pale girl with a crush on him and a bone to pick with society. They go on these madcap and oft-times nonsensical seeming adventures. Their most frequent antagonists are the Freebies, Jimmy, Marlon, and Burke. This makes it sound far more structured than it was, narrative-wise, not storytelling-wise. The stories adhere to their own internal absurdist logic, but they don't follow, for example, the more linear superhero format that many may be familiar with if they read more mainstream fare. They're also very adult in nature. They push the envelope in terms of what's shown. That comes to nudity, drug use, as well as the balance between cartoonish violence and more visceral. I will never forget the crushing of Whitey's nose. This to block her senses that she's no longer falling for the manipulator. This collection contains not just the 12 issues that ran in The Face magazine in 1996, The Face being a music magazine in the UK, but also it has essays detailing the time, the subcultural space that it arose in. There's also a lengthy essay from co-creator Wakeham, which details how it's following off of Hewlett's Tank Girl, the beginning of their partnership and collaboration, and the attempts of this work to be something even more subversive and confrontational to the mainstream, which adds a bit of a layer of irony to the fact that it's debuting in the magazine that it does, which, while it is part of a kind of countercultural landscape, also is playing into the pop culture scene, which is also something that is lambasted a lot in Get The Freebies, especially celebrity culture. It's just a bit amusing because the first issue that it debuts in has Keith Flint of The Prodigy on the cover. These essays are good because they provide context. And context is key. And that way, this collection becomes in some ways a bit of a historic artifact. It's showing where Get The Freebies came from, and also where it attempted to go. The Phoo Action portion refers to all it was saved from the cancelled second series and newly completed segments. There's also an entire section dedicated to the failed attempted show. The script is there, and there are also some mock-ups of what the set would have looked like, who was cast in the pilot, which we'll get to a little bit. So, it's Get The Freebies. From beginning to end, how it started, where it was going, where it didn't go. And that's very fascinating. Because while many may have heard of Tank Girl, Get The Freebies is less well known. If one looks at it, one can instantly see the blueprint for some of the Gorillaz designs and characters. Whitey is very much Noodle's older sister in terms of design. So you can see how the visuals carry over, and that's not the only instance of it. But also in many ways, this work is an interesting cultural touchstone. The 90s indie scene, in terms of North America, tends to largely be remembered through the lens of image. So people instantly tend to think of big pouches, superheroes with lots of guns, and in some cases, depending how in the know they are of the lore, many a missed deadline. There was, of course, much more going on than that. Not just in North America, but also beyond. Get Freebies gives a bit of a window into another space, the British scene. And because you have all the history surrounding it, you get a real sense of it. Get The Freebies. This is a work that very much enjoys its positioning as a countercultural or subcultural work. Those aren't interchangeable, just as happens to be floating in both spaces. It's having fun being that, and it's very deliberately composed, which is something that could be lost if one just glances through it, which is something that one can't really do in this more curated presentation. The way this book is laid out is very much trying to guide you through it. It also lays out how much work went into it, as well as the details of the creation process, and there's lots of pictures of it at various stages, which if you're a comic history nerd is very fun. It's just as fun as getting to read the actual issues, which you also get to do. And this is a bigger book, so you get to see everything in large detail, which really showcases Hewlett's style, which lends itself itself to this format, the acrylic markers look very good. Everything's just very vibrant and saturated. Not everything's been touched up either, and when it has been, they let you know. So with all that said, what's the series like? What are the 12 issues like? The context that the essays provide is a very good thing, because divorced from the subcultural environment that birthed it, and the original magazine housing it, just going into this comic may be too much for some. Those details of the time it hails from, and where and why, really ground some of the happenings as much as they can be. The first issue, which was completely reworked, and they have the original pages in there as well, the printed version is a meta tale of the comic being pitched to producers of High as a Kite Productions, and it very much sets the tone, the multiple layers of cheeky and at times flippant humor, both in the spoken dialogue, the action, and the visuals. And when combined, it can create an almost erratic surrealist feeling at points, such as you have the joke of how the producers are constantly smoking, but in each panel they're smoking something different, either be it apparatus or what they're smoking. This is also an introduction to the characters, but also the chaos of the pitching process and how it changes the idea as they go. How the expectations of the time can shape what the product becomes, but also how some of it is ramped up on the producer's side as well. It's very interesting, the interplay, the way it's presented. Hewlett had commented, as detailed in an essay by Wakeham in this book, about how while they were watching the process of Tank Girl being created, it was quite obvious that the studios were looking to take the base concept and commodify it and repackage it in a way that was palatable, or at least more marketable. This when it came to the film adaptation. And in that way, it lost some of the edge and the cool factor, which is why they wanted it in the first place. And there's a little bit of defiance in the creation process of Get Freebies as a result. This comic series does contain many elements that would need to be sanitized during the adaptation, like coming out the gate with Terry drugging Whitey with hormones to make sure she doesn't develop voluptuously. This to try and make her appear more innocent to save her public image because she's out there partying all the time. It's pretty dark. It's meant to be cruelly amusing, but it's something that particularly through a 2020s lens, could give one pause. That's part of why the context and coming at it from that angle is really useful. It allows one to appraise the work on its own terms, much as being intentionally provocative. It's trying to push the envelope. That's part of the dig it's taking at mainstream culture. And once the series gets going fully in episode 2, that becomes more apparent, such as when they face their first villain alongside the freebies, Senor Embargo. There's clear and in-depth knowledge of the traditional comic format. It's just being twisted and played with. So for example, in that, instead of the focus being on the battle, it's much more on how Whitey's annoyed that she has to go deal with it by herself because Terry's been taken off and he's being hit on somewhere. Terry's orientation was likely a bit more pushing the envelope at the time than it reads as today, but Get Freebies is very open about it, and it's a source for both comedy and drama, but the former not at Phoo's expense. It's usually at the people around him. As I was reading through it, I was very curious what the experience would have been reading it actually inside of the magazine which originally housed it. What was before and after it, that kind of thing. Because there are many things that I need to censor, like Terry doing naked yoga in the kitchen when Whitey comes in and uses his penis to stir her coffee to break his zen. It's the kind of thing where this work is not going to resonate with everyone, especially when one finds themselves removed from the era that's directly speaking to. While some of the elements are more evergreen, some are much more tied to 90s British celebrity culture. Although some are going to enjoy it from that level because it very much takes one back to the scene of that time. There's a whole story about escaping Gallagher's Island, as in the Oasis Gallagher's. They feature as recurring characters just randomly. And one of my favorite jokes was in episode 7. They're called episodes, not chapters. It's when one of the brothers tells Terry that he's bigger than baby Jesus, and Terry just responds, of course he is, because he's a grown man. So not all the jokes are R-rated or rely on sex and drugs. Not everything is shock value. And it's in the moments like that where it's clear why the adaptation Phoo Action would be attempted. If one stripped back the more cutting elements, it could be transferred because the base format, because of what it's satirizing, is familiar. It's just in that transfer, it removes a lot of the core elements of what the series was doing, that kind of glib, disrespectful, and at times caustic energy. Moments like the kid pit, the underground fighting ring for celebrity children. It's very dark and pointedly cutting, and something still relevant. It was really fascinating to read through this. But there's more, because you get to see the follow-up series, what was meant to be the follow-up comic series Phoo Action, which is where the TV series series that would have been takes its name and where this collection also takes its name. That didn't end up fully coming to fruition. It did get canceled, though what did is contained in this collection. But a lot of the sample pitches, what could be saved and what was still around, are contained in here. And courtesy of Matt Wakeham, the process of what could have been is chronicled. Not only do they describe the method in which they worked, which they liken to the Marvel method, and you do get to see some of what could have been, or at least read it. Because it didn't go over quite so well at the time, even though the change was only from 1996 to 1997. But by the time of the second pitch, some of the elements were regarded as too juvenile. And part of that could have been because there was editorial changeover happening at the magazine, but also the times were starting to shift. During this process, some of the art was lost forever. But in this, Wakeham took what was left and presented prose renditions of those stories. So you get to read through what would have been Phoo Action. So if you're a fan of Get The Freebies, then that's a real treat, because you get to see what was supposed to come next, or as close as one can. Obviously, pure prose is a much different format than comics, but it is really interesting to read through where things could have gone, and it's also just a different experience of the characters. Although there is some time and distance between the original plotting and the writing of these, so the tone isn't exactly the same. That's neither good nor bad, it's just a statement. It's a reinforcement of how in the moment the original production was. Those stories comprise the third part of the book because it's broken up by era. You have the beginning of the process and the time, you have the Get Freebies, you have the Phoo Action, and the last two segments are dedicated to what wasn't and the restoration process. This final part also contains how this book almost seemed at points like it wasn't going to happen. This collection, the stops and the starts. Speaking of, if you're curious, the pilot is on YouTube, time of recording, for the TV series that would have been. It was from 2008. It was on BBC 3, I think. It was meant to be 6 episodes. The first is out there. You can go check it out and see for yourself what it would have been like.
The prophecy speaks of one who is destined to use the loincloth to restore order. But it says nothing about them turning into hot pants.
It leans very heavily into the silly side of the superhero satire and plays there.
Tell you, Phoo, I've done a lot of stupid things in my time, but none of them live and on morning news.
Now, in this book, you get to see the history of the preservation process, just everything. You also get a good look at the creator's different relationship with the work when it came time to try and collect it again. I, for one, am very glad that the time and effort was made to compile this. Not just the comic itself, but all the extra details surrounding it. The history, the minutiae. Obviously, part of that is to increase the collectability factor, but I think it's important. Speaking of the collectability, though, they did package this quite lovingly. It's very nicely put together. It has the heavy-duty slipcase, it has the extra art, you have all of the nice embossing on the outer area of the case. The book itself is solid, glossy, nicely bound. There is an attached ribbon bookmark to keep your place. It's beautiful. But to me, what's even more beautiful is what's inside and the fact that it's now there and kept in a nice format for others to see. Without endeavors like this could have become one of the lost comics out there, and there would have just been this link in its chain of creation and various pop culture that would have just been lost. Because when you look at this art, you can see the direct influence it had on the Gorillaz. There's a correlation that takes it all the way back to Tank Girls, the music scene of the 90s. There are just so many elements. Everything is a tapestry. And the more one can see of it, the more one can understand it. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's gonna like it. This is a very specific thing for a very specific type of fan. Some aren't gonna be as enamored with the history or may not find it interesting. There are also some who may not resonate with the work's tone. Some of what was once transgressive, boundary-pushing, shocking is much less so if one has come from reading different eras. So it may no longer feel that way for the reader of today, and in that sense, some of it may come across as more juvenile, which was the complaint that was eventually levied against it, or at least against the attempted continuation. And I'm sure some against it itself when it was originally running. As even during the comic's own lifetime, sensibilities were starting to shift. Culture is always changing, always moving, and so what is then made as a response or a counter to it changes as well. Personally, I think it stands out as more in the time capsule, though. You can really see the evolution of the work and the thought process behind it. You can watch it get tighter and more confident as it evolves. You can also feel how much the creative team were vibing making it. And it does have some things to say about celebrity culture and worship that really hold up. And some of the jokes geared towards superheroing still land because superheroes are still such a prominent genre in the comic space. It's always compelling to see different different forms of comics because they are an art form, and that side of them can at times be diminished or dismissed. But as an art form, they're a form of expression, and there are so many different ways that they can do it. And this has some striking moments. The adventures of Terry and Whitey are at times like a fever dream. That's part of the fun. You really don't know where they're going to end up next. And while the show, as demonstrated, would have been doable, it did lose some of that element, and that removed some of the more rebellious aspects that were baked into this. I found this really fascinating, and I wanted to share it with you. Got a number on the back. I know it's quite niche, but sometimes that's where the whims take us. If you're a fan of discovering indie fare, this is for you. If you're a fan of British 90s subcultural indie comics, this is for you. If you're a comic history nerd. There's also, as mentioned, the collectability factor to it, which I know for some is up there. There are multiple editions of this, for example. I have the deluxe edition. There's also a super deluxe edition. It has things like a signed numbered tip-in sheet by Hewlett and Wakeham, embroidered patches, and extra art prints. That's definitely one for the mega fans out there. There's 500 copies you can get your collectible on. I'm the sort who's all about what's inside, and what's inside is really, really interesting and gorgeous. I really can't overstate how much the colors pop. It's so vibrant. They really made the work sing. If it sounds like it's up your alley, I will have a link down below. Again, it's not sponsored. It's not an affiliate link. I just know that this is a bit more of a niche thing. So if you're really interested, I thought I would make it easier. It's down there. And if this doesn't sound like it's for you, now you know if you stumble upon it. So I want to hear from you. Do you remember this? Did you read it? Does it look like something that'd be up your alley? Is it not for you at all? Your thoughts, I want to hear them. Please, as ever, put them down below. Thanks so much for taking some time today to spend discussing comics with me. I really appreciate it. Do all the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe. As always, there will be more videos coming soon, and I'll see you there. Bye-bye.